So in today's web dev tip, we're going to be carrying on with our full end-to-end project, and we're carrying on with our stats feature, giving you the ability to actually see some stats of who's accessed one of the short URLs. So what we're going to be focusing on in this lesson is simply just putting a title on the page for the stats app when it loads. And that doesn't sound like much, but we need to consider a couple of things here. We need to consider whether the user has provided us with a legitimate path parameter for one of the short URLs, and if they haven't, then we need to say something like there's no stats available here, or maybe redirect them to an error page. So what we're going to do is just create that element on the page in this tutorial, but we're going to do it all through our TypeScript. So the first step we're going to do in our markup here is just remove everything, and don't forget I just copied and pasted this from the web app from the previous tutorials, so it has got a lot of classes and structure from the previous app. So we're going to put our title inside of this strapline section. We could change this to something else and update our SCSS or just give it a specific ID, but this will do just for selecting the elements on the page and then inserting some content into it. So if you just go back to the web app, you can see it should just look a bit like a blank version of the web app. So here we're just going to first of all display a title to the user, and first of all we're just going to let them know what short URL they're accessing stats for, or if it doesn't exist in the database, if we get a negative response from the API, then we'll tell them that there's no stats for that particular URL. Okay, so let's go over to our TypeScript to start work on that. So the first thing I'm going to do is just get a reference to that strapline element. So we'll say the strapline element is equal to the result of a document query selector. So this time we're just targeting the element with the class of strapline, and so we can reuse that within our code to actually update and insert some content into that div. And we're going to do that in here in the response that we get back from the API. So let's just access the result of that in a result variable, and I'll continue to console log that out as well, just so we can see and investigate that in the console if we need to. So we're going to create a heading element, very much like we did in the strapline for the web app, and I'm actually going to do this by creating a function which will create a new h2 tag and then return it with some text that's provided as an argument to this function. So that might look something like this. So it's something like create heading, and it's going to be a function that accepts some text, which is a string. So with this, we're going to create a new h2 tag element. So we'll say document.create element, and obviously we want h2. And then all we're going to do is say the h2 tag.text content is equal to whatever text has been passed in to this function. And with that, we'll just return it. So we'll say h2 tag is returned from that function, and then we can reuse this function to create different headings depending on the text that we want to put into the heading on the page. Okay, so what we'll do down here is if we go back to the console and just have a look at the statuses that we get. So if we've got an OK status, then we've actually got some data. We've got some information about this particular URL's redirects. So what we want to do is check if that status property is OK. So if we say if the result that we get, if the status there is, spell it correctly, is equal to OK, then what we can do is we can populate the heading on the page with the heading, with the information, with the title that we're accessing stats for this particular ID that we've parsed from the URL. So we'll just in here say strapline element dot append child, and then what we're going to append onto it, well, we're going to create one of those heading elements that we did with the function a moment ago. So we'll say create a heading with the text of viewing stats for, and then we'll just say URL, and then we'll just pass in the ID in there, and that will append into the strapline element that h2 element that the create heading function will create. And if the status isn't OK, then we know we've got a problem. And what we should find, just to demonstrate that, if you missed it in previous tutorials, is the status is error. And we've also got this message property on the result as well. So we could use that text to display something to the user, or we could inline our own text as well. So we'll say the strapline element append child, and then we'll say create a heading. And the heading we're going to create is, let's use the data that's come back from the API here, the message from there. So we'll say result.message. And if we save that, what we'll find is we'll get that message from the API displaying on the page. So there you go, you can see it working there when there's a bad ID that's been passed through. So we get the message from the API appearing on the page, but if not, if we actually pass in a good short URL ID, then obviously we get this message for viewing the stats. So there we go, that's quite good. It's just using a little bit of error handling, and it's utilizing some of the details that are coming back from the API if there are any problems. So with that in place, we can start working on the table, which is just going to display a list of those redirects, the access property and the location property that's been passed back in the data that's been provided by the API. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.